Hi, I'm JP and you're watching the Coffee Channel, and today I'm going to be talking about grinders. Not the sort that you have on your app on your iPhone, if you're that way inclined. The sort that you use for grinding coffee. Now, there hasn't been a lot of choice with home grinders over the years. You either had something that was very basic and hand operated, like the Harrier Skirton we tested a while ago, or you had to go for something maybe a second-hand commercial grinder, which would be huge, really unwieldy, noisy, taking up too much space in your kitchen. In recent years, there have been a lot more home grinders, some at the very expensive end of the market. Recently, though, there's been a grinder that's kind of hit a reasonable price point, and when I say reasonable, I mean £500. So it's still pretty expensive, and you've still got to make a pretty firm commitment to being a home barista if you want to buy one of these. But it has got some great features. It's fairly small, it's light, it's not too loud, and it should fit in most people's kitchens. And more importantly, it should make great coffee. I'm going to have a look at it now. We'll look at some of the features, make some coffee with it, compare it to our EK43. Then I'm going to bring in my friend Hugh, who actually owns one of these machines and has been using it for about a year now, and have his long-term ownership views of this particular grinder. So the Niche Zero has been around for quite a few years now, maybe 2 years. Started off as an Indiegogo crowdfunded project. The idea really, and the idea behind the name, is there's zero retention. So when you're grinding at home, you don't want to have a load of retention in your funnel that you get with a lot of commercial grinders, because you're probably only grinding 1 or 2 coffees at a time, and you might be changing the setting quite a lot. So zero retention is important in a coffee shop. It's even more important at home because it's such a pain when you've got retention when you're changing a grind and you're still getting some of the old grind settings coming through, some of the coffee that was made the previous grind setting. It just doesn't work as a great piece of kind of workflow when you're using a grind that's got loads of retention. So what it's got to remove any retention is a very straight flow from the burrs down into the chamber that releases it into the cup that you use. So we'll take a look at that in a second. It works at very low RPM, so we're looking at sort of 320-ish RPM, which is like a quarter of what many commercial grinders work at. So it's slow, there's no doubt about it. It's quite slow compared to a commercial grinder. But then you're not going to need to knock out coffee after coffee if you're using it as a home machine. If it takes an extra 10 seconds, that's not going to be the end of the world at home. Really doesn't matter. In a coffee shop, it's a different matter entirely. In terms of the burrs it uses, they didn't reinvent the wheel with this one. They actually used the burrs from Mazda's Coney grinder. So Mazda are a company that have been around for years. They're a respected company that make mainly conical burrs in their bigger grinders, and that's what features here. So we've got 63mm conical burrs running at fairly low RPM. Conical burrs have kind of fallen out of favour a little bit lately with the arrival of big flatbed grinders like the EK43. Conical burrs tend to produce a slightly wider range of particle sizes, so you get more fines with them, generally speaking. And the Coney is renowned for having a fair amount of fines coming out of it. So it's not a grinder that has a very kind of unimodal particle distribution like an EK43. But that may not make a real difference when we're talking about the cup. So we'll take them side by side with an espresso in a minute, and we'll see whether there's an appreciable difference. The good thing about having these burrs is that they're not reinventing the wheel. They're able to have a good quality burr set and keep it at a reasonable price. So you're getting a grinder at a considerably lower price point than something with an equivalent burr set like the Coney, which is going to cost probably at least double this. Now the Coney will be a bit quicker. It'll have some features in it that will make it better for workflow in a coffee shop environment, but we're not really bothered about that. We're looking at this for home use only. One of the things you'll notice about the Niche Zero is the lack of a hopper. Now most commercial grinders have quite large hoppers to have a weight of beans in the hopper that will stop popcorning. And popcorning is the effect when beans get shot up from the grinder burrs, shot up into the air, and they come back down into the burrs and then cause inconsistent grinds. Obviously you don't want that because you get an inconsistent extraction with your coffee. How you avoid that is to have a couple of different methods. We'll look at how that's done in this particular grinder on the EK43, which you can single dose, so you can dose one dose at a time, one dose of coffee, and measure out a certain amount of coffee each time rather than having a weight of beans in there. That has vertically aligned burrs which don't have so much popcorning. With a niche zero, you measure out the amount of coffee that you want, you put it into the chamber, and then although the burrs are horizontally aligned, there's a little mechanism that stops the popcorning. We'll look at that a little bit later. So the advantage of not having a hopper is that you save a lot of space. Your hopper would take up so much space you wouldn't be able to fit it in your kitchen, under kitchen units and cabinets and that sort of thing. Plus also, you don't want to have a whole load of beans in your hopper when you're doing home baristaing, because you're not going to be making 10 coffees in a go unless you've got a big host of friends who are coming around. You're going to be making them one at a time. So that's one thing that's quite unique to this particular grinder. We'll take a look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. What we've also got is stepless grind adjustment. So the grind setting is adjusted on a stepless collar by moving this collar backwards and forwards. And there's a whole range of grind settings here, from very fine, so Turkish coffee, through to espresso, all the way through to filter coffees, French presses, etc. So you can grind for pretty much any type of coffee. I don't think it's designed myself explicitly for the coarser end of the grind. I think that it's more designed to make more of an espresso type of coffee. It's quite fines heavy, as we'll see. I've seen the grind distribution this burr set in the past. It is quite fines heavy. So it's going to favour espresso more than it's going to favour things like French press, AeroPress, V60 because of the grind distribution. So it's stepless, and what that means is that there are no individual little steps, so it doesn't click into place. Now with some grinders that can cause issues because as the grinder vibrates it kind of moves slightly. We'll see whether Hugh has had a problem with that, but having seen other reviews of this grinder, no one's mentioned it being a problem. Plus it also gives you an infinite amount of adjustment on the grind collar, whereas stepless grinders like an Amphim Super Carmano I used to have, you always seem to be slightly between the settings. It's so irritating. You find that one setting is like slightly too coarse and then you move it up to the next notch and then it's slightly too fine. So stepless, in my opinion, always works better. It's also got a nice feature where you can recalibrate the grinder. So after it's been worn, you can, after the burrs have been worn slightly, you can then recalibrate it so it's zeroed at the right point and all your grind settings kind of remain the same, even when your grinder is a few years old. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually have a look at it in practice, talk about how it works, and we're going to make coffee with it and see how it tastes. So the coffee I'm going to use for this particular experiment is the Mazungo from Gardelli. The reason I'm using this is it's a coffee that requires a very, very fine grind. In fact, I'm on the absolute limits on my EK with coffee burrs in it. It's at the clipping point to get the coffee fine enough to produce a good espresso. So it'll be interesting to see how this copes with that. It does seem to go pretty fine actually. From a few tests we've done before the video, it seems to be able to grind really, really quite fine actually. So we're going to try it now. So what you need to do with these coffees, as you'd expect, you need to measure out the dose beforehand. So I'm going 18 in, and then I'm going to go for about 40 out. I'm hoping to get there. I know from experience on my EK that I go for about 1840. Now with a conical burr grinder, you tend to have to use a slightly different ratio. So you tend to have to go for more of a 2-to-1 ratio, purely because of the nature of the grind and the fact that you can't push the extraction as high without it tasting bad. So I'm going to be a little bit conservative. I'm going to go for 18 grams in, 36 grams out, and I'm aiming for about 27 seconds roughly. So I've measured out my coffee. I've got 18 grams here. Now, conical grinders tend to produce a slightly different distribution of particles, as I've said earlier, than something like the EK. So the ratio that I'd use for the UK would be something like 18 grams in, 40 to 42 grams out on this particular coffee. With the conical grind, I'm going to go for a bit of a more traditional ratio of 2 to 1. So I'm going to look for about 36 grams out in around 25 to 27 seconds, maybe a bit longer. This requires a very fine grind. So we're actually on a setting, I've had a little experiment before we started. I'm on a setting of about 7 out of 50. So it's really fine. It's as fine as really Turkish coffee. But I know that this particular coffee needs it. If it was something like an Ethiopian coffee, I'd expect to be much more in the kind of range that it says here on the dial for espresso. But this particular coffee, I want to see whether this machine can actually cope with the fineness of grind that this particular coffee needs. So I measured out 18 grams. I'm going to pour it into here. And then basically there's a little button on the underneath the lid that will be depressed.
I think you ought to know I'm feeling very depressed.
And that will allow it to start grinding. That's to stop you putting your hands in it and doing all sorts of daft things. So you can't actually grind anything until you push this lid all the way down. Then you just flip this switch here and that will start the grind. Now, as you notice, it's not that quick, as I said before, but it's not so slow that you're thinking, oh God, I wish this would hurry up. It's actually about right. And the interesting thing about this is, as the name suggests, there really is zero or close to zero retention. So I'm going to switch it off now. And if you notice, we've used the cup that we measured the coffee out with. That comes with the machine and it's sized exactly so it fits onto a 58mm portafilter, which is really useful. Much more useful than the sort of thing we have with an EK, just a wine measure that fits the EK funnel, but then is not great for actually distributing the coffee in the portafilter itself. So if we look, we've got exactly what I put in. We haven't got any retention there at all, which is actually a lot better than the EK. With the EK, we'd be doing a whole load of this sort of stuff to try and get any grinds out, and there's always some retention. And you notice that that's the case if you switch from a slightly darker coffee to a slightly lighter one. For quite a few coffees after you've changed coffee, you'll still notice flecks of the darker coffee in amongst the lighter coffee. So there is definitely more retention on the EK than there is on the niche, and that's really important for home use because you're going to be switching between coffees. You know, you're going to be going between 250 gram bags of coffee, so you don't want any retention because you're going to use up coffees, wasting coffees, and it ends up being quite expensive. Right, let's make an espresso and see how it tastes. So we've got a decent looking espresso here. It came out slightly beyond what I wanted to make it as. I got 38 grams out. Didn't quite stop it quickly enough in 25 seconds. So it's probably a little bit under extracted. I imagine it needs to grind a couple of steps finer to make it taste perfect. But this should be ballpark. In terms of how much grind adjustment we've got left, we've got a fair bit. So whereas the EK was right on its limits to get sort of 27-second extraction, this I think could actually go finer than the EK. That is with coffee burrs on the EK rather than the Turkish burrs. So if you have the Turkish burrs, it would definitely go a bit finer, but at the expense of being able to produce nice filter coffee. I've always found the coffee burrs are more wide-ranging and they have a wider range of uses than the Turkish burrs on the EK. Right, I'm going to give it a little bit of a shake. So it smells pretty good. Okay, so I've let it cool down for a little bit. Obviously you want to not drink your espresso as soon as it comes off the machine. It's going to be too hot to appreciate all the flavours. So it's the same as with filter coffee really. I used to always recommend below sort of 55 degrees when I was when I had my coffee shop, and in fact I used to give people a temperature sensor so that they could drink it at the right temperature. The problem with drinking it when it's too hot is it always tends to taste a bit over extracted. The heat has that effect, and then that kind of ruins the flavour for the whole thing. So it should be about right now. Let's give it a try. Okay, so it could be pushed a bit higher on extraction. It's interesting that some of the fruit flavours in there are a bit more muted than they are with the EK. So it's got a bit more texture. It's got a slightly more traditional espresso feel to it, so it's a bit more viscous. And that's a product of the fines in there. So there are more fines in this particular espresso than with the EK, purely because of the way conical grinders tend to grind the coffee. They tend to produce more oval shaped particles, which also has a different impact on flavour. So you tend to get a slightly muted flavour compared to the EK, so it's not like quite as clear, but there's a bit more kind of mouthfeel somehow, so it's a bit more viscous, a bit more traditional espresso. So there's a bit less kind of longevity of the flavour at the end, but we're talking fairly small kind of increments here. If you're talking about spending like 500 quid versus 2,500 quid, there's no way the EK is 5 times as good as this. It's probably like 10% better. It's just a sort of different flavour. Obviously the EK you'd be using a slightly longer ratio, but we're only talking about probably 2 or 3 grams that I made here. So the difference is not solely the fact that the EK would be making a kind of lower concentration coffee. It's actually a difference to the composition of the coffee itself. Let's try again. In fact, as I go down through the coffee, it's actually getting pretty good. As getting down there, it's got a nice kind of thickness to the flavour. It's got that viscosity. It's got more mouthfeel than you get with the EK. Okay, it's slightly less subtle, but maybe you gain in other ways. What I would probably do if I was dialing in this coffee a bit more, I would probably go a couple of notches finer, and I'd run it maybe a little bit shorter. So I'd run it a bit more traditional. I'd probably go 18 grams in, maybe 34 grams out, and take the timing a bit longer, so maybe up to like 28, 29 seconds. Make a sort of thicker espresso, and I think that would play to the strengths of this particular grinder. I think now it's time to talk about kind of the long-term ownership experience of this grinder, so I'm going to get Hugh in and we're going to have a look at it from that perspective. So joining me now is friend of the channel, Hugh Mullally, who's also the owner of this lovely machine. He's lent it to us today so that we can review it without any ties to manufacturers or freebies or anything like that. We can be completely impartial. Actually, he also owns this machine, which I'm hoping he's forgotten about because we've been using it for several years now. Well, that's a different matter. So Hugh,
I get lots of free coffee.
Well, that's true. Now, how long have you had this then?
I got it in April last year.
Right. Okay. So we're talking about a year and a bit.
Yeah.
Of usage. And you've got an espresso machine at home, so you use it for espresso solely, yeah?
No, not solely. My son, I drink some filter, but my son drinks a lot of filter, so I will, typically in the morning, my son's there, I'll make it an espresso-based drink, and then immediately a filter.
Right. Okay.
Which is where the benefit of this comes in, because it is a single shot.
Yeah, which is perfect. And you find zero retention, as I've found.
Although I must admit, I never actually proved it for myself, but you did just then when you weighed out as well.
Yeah. And in terms of usability, you've had no issues with it at all, no sort of problems?
No, I mean, I was away for a month, and when I came back, I started using it again. I found a problem, which I thought was the machine, but it was actually a particular coffee, which I think had just gone. Right. So I started using it on a new. I got some new beans, and then it was fine.
Right. Okay. What was happening? Just coming out really quickly, or?
Too long, actually. Strangely.
Too long. Okay, that's interesting. Normally, when coffee's stale.
No, you're right. Too quickly.
It was coming out really quickly. So you just couldn't get it fine enough.
Yeah.
And it's like it's lost all of its flavour. Yeah. I mean, one of the things we noticed when we were actually trying to calibrate it earlier was that it's got some sort of cutout function that you can't actually clip the burrs together. So with the EK, if you adjust it incorrectly, you can actually get the burrs grinding together and you can hear it. And we didn't get to that stage here. I didn't read anything in their manual about this when I had a quick look earlier, but it seems to have some sort of built-in protection to stop you setting up so it's so fine the burrs are connecting it by the look of it, doesn't it?
Yeah, we weren't actually sure about that. It could have been the connector there.
That's true. I mean, we didn't get... But the good thing is it does seem to go really, really fine.
Yeah. And
it does seem to be able to produce coffee over a range of particle sizes. I mean, that thing is really useful.
Yes, I think that's beautiful. I think the whole thing is a beautiful piece of design. And when you first see it, it looks slightly odd, but actually it's really elegant. And it fits into the kitchen really well. My wife, as you know, is not a massive fan of espresso machines, and this doesn't upset her at all. If I had an EK, I'd probably be divorced. Yeah,
it's a nightmare. I had that particular EK in my own kitchen. It was a complete nightmare. It makes so much mess everywhere. Yeah, it does produce the best tasting coffee, I think, of any grinder, ultimately. But it's just not worth a hassle for home use unless you've got a massive space. It just makes so much mess. If you go into any coffee shop, you look around under the EK, they'll have some sort of thing catching loads of grinds, or they'll be constantly cleaning. It's just a nightmare, and it's the same for making one coffee a day as for making sort of 20 or 200. It just seems to make a mess whatever you do with it. Whereas it's all pretty contained, really. I mean, there's a few grounds around here that we can see, mainly because what I did earlier, which you might see on a bloopers reel at the end of this, is I forgot to put this under there, and I ground a coffee and it went into there and it went all over the place. So you do actually have to remember
to be fair, it didn't. It's true. It kind of made quite an elegant pyramid.
Yeah, made a little pyramid. You couldn't really have got it into your portafilter without getting a little teaspoon out and spooning it in. But and this thing sort of rests on there, does it? Well, I'm not
yes,
sure.
it is.
I suppose that's
just to hold the.
Yeah, it just holds up nicely. But of course, if you haven't got a 58mm portafilter, then that's not going to be quite as good. But most commercial machines, except for La Spaziales, I think, have 58mm portafilters. So
home machines do.
Home machines do as well. I think what home machine have you got?
A Magica, Brazil Magica.
Yeah, so that's like an E61 group head, isn't it? I think it's like a modified E61. Yeah. It's a heat exchanger with a
it is. Yeah.
But it's got a PID on it as well. Yeah. So you can make really good coffee with that setup.
Yeah.
Which is say 500 for this.
And it was about 1,400 for the
So under £2,000, that's a good home setup. You know, and if you think about that now with the price of coffee, if you want to justify that for yourself,
by the way.
better put a block on that. I think if you think about that for under £2,000, maybe factor in a bit of water filtration if you're really going to take it seriously. But you're looking at maybe
Talking about that, I use what you use, which is the Peak.
Yeah, the Peak. Yeah, that's a good idea for that sort of use. It's not that expensive, although I don't think it copes that well with water that's really, really hard. I find it a little bit problematic with that. But
is that here?
Yeah, that's for another video. Ideally, I think you get the best water if you mix it yourself or get some of the Bass Max Premium. But the Peak does produce fairly decent quality water for coffee. The thing about this, I mean, it doesn't create any mess either, does it? You're not getting a whole unit full of mess.
You occasionally get a bit of kind of dust down here.
Yeah.
But that's easy to take out and sip away.
Yeah.
But no, it's a beautiful design. I really like it.
And you've not noticed any burr creep when you find, because we were talking earlier about it being stepless, and sometimes you get a bit of burr creep where you make a coffee, then the next day you have to adjust it quite a lot because the burrs have kind of crept slightly because it's being kept in place by friction rather than by some sort of stepped mechanism.
I mean, I generally, so I generally have a bag of beans and I dial it in. There might be a slight adjustment from day to day, but not very much.
Only as much as expect for different temperatures, humidities, that sort of thing. So actually, I mean, I'm pretty impressed. Actually, I was a little bit skeptical because I've never been a massive fan of Mazza grinders, and obviously the grinder, like a big component part of the grinder, and the thing that makes the most difference to the flavour of the coffee from that grinder are the burrs. And certainly the Roba, which I've used in the past, which is the bigger conical burr grinder from Mazza, which shares the same type of burrs, but they're just enlarged to 80 something mils, I can't remember offhand. It always hit like an extraction kind of peak at about 19%, and once you tried to get over 19% extraction, it just produced terrible tasting coffee. It was really popular 10 years ago. It's such a fast grinder, and it was, it had an on-demand function that worked quite well for the time, but it didn't produce amazing tasting coffee, especially with lighter roasts. So I thought the Coney Bears might be a little bit like that in this, but this is a slightly lower RPM grinder. I think the combination of that and the Coney Bears, which may produce a bit less particle variation than the Robas, I think makes actually a pretty decent espresso. I mean, I think you could easily use this as your home coffee grinder and never want for anything else. I don't think there's any point these days for home use going above that level. I really don't think it's worth it. Like diminishing returns. This will do everything you need it to do at home without the problems that come with home grinders or commercial grinders. Home grinders usually like very inconsistent move about. I did some training in people's houses in the past where they had little Marconi grinders, which was still like 400 quid. And then you grind finer and finer and finer, and then the coffee would start getting coarser again because the burrs were not really big enough, or there was some problem with the burr carrier mechanism. Whereas this seems to produce like consistently good coffee, from what I hear from people who use them and from you. Doesn't move out of adjustment much, and you get a decent coffee in a small package for what's a fairly reasonable price. £500 is not cheap, but it's not bad, is it?
No, it's not. Not for this, I would say.
Yeah.
Can I just say something about the buying experience? So the thing with these, I mean, I don't know if it's still the case, but certainly when I bought it, they make a limited run every month, and literally, basically they announce when they're coming out, and it's a bit like a mini Glastonbury experience. You basically bring up multiple browsers, and I tried for about 4 months before I was actually able to get on and buy one because they sell out in half an hour.
And they were selling at a premium, weren't they? Or on the second-hand market.
Yes, I mean you could buy one of these and then sell it for £800 on eBay if you wanted.
I think it looks like they've got the supply issues sorted a bit. I mean, that was kind of mid-pandemic, mid-lockdown sort of situation. I think that's probably the peak demand and probably the lowest supply point in terms of they're getting parts. So looking at their site now, it looks like you can click buy now and get one. Now, I haven't been through the whole buying process to see what actually happens once you click the pay button. But I think the availability is probably a lot better than it was when you bought it.
Well, another thing I'd just like to say is that the nice thing about this is it's a family business as well. Yeah, isn't it? Very small. Yeah, so small business. Yeah. Where do they ship from? Do you know? Where they? No, I don't. I knew in the past, but I don't know.
Yeah. But
I mean UK based.
The UK based. Yeah, okay, but it is UK based. Yeah. So there you go. If any of you have this grinder or have any questions about this grinder, we'd like to hear from you. Just drop us a line in the comment section, like and subscribe. Send us your thoughts. Anything else you'd like us to review? If you think there's anything else that is the equal of this for similar sort of money, let us know and we'll see if we can get hold of it and do a review. Till next time, cheers.
Thank you.
So let's get it grinding. Well, we might have to move. We might have to move slightly to a. As I forgot to actually plug the fucking thing in. We might have to. You can cut to a. Fucking hell!
I hope you got that recorded. Because you use a carrier in this.
At least it didn't spit out and like
Oh, brilliant.
It's still recording. Yeah. There's a bit of a rookie error for you. Oh, Jesus Christ. I've actually put any coffee in the...
You're not doing too well today.
Oh, no, it's one of those days.